Hi there, I'm Scott Lowe with Actual Tech Media, and I'm here with Jeff Reedy, who is the CEO of Scale Computing. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, thanks for having me.
So Scale Computing has been around for a long time.
Yeah, 11 years.
I first met you guys back at VMworld 10 or 11 years ago, and you have come a long, long way in the market. Everybody talks about a lot of the players. You're up there with the big ones, which is great.
Yeah.
But you have a very different niche than a lot of those other players, and it's working for you, and it's working for your customers. Can you tell us a little about where you play and what you do?
Yeah, so over 3,000 deployments, even though we sort of sometimes fly under the radar a little bit. But we really focus on environments where you have sort of anywhere from 0 to maybe 1 or 2 IT people on site. So today we now start calling those edge environments sometimes, but that also covers your traditional kind of SMB, robo, distributed enterprise, those types of places. But what's always made Scale unique is that there's a whole layer of kind of automation technology in the product that, is a big fancy way of saying you don't need an administrator, right? The things that can go wrong in an environment, if you think about it, okay, I'm going to deploy a Linux cluster in a fast food restaurant. Right. Sounds like a recipe for disaster, right? But we basically replaced what would have been an IT staff on site, which doesn't exist, with automation. So when stuff goes wrong, the system just fixes itself. And so we've had a lot of success. Originally in the SMB, so 11 years ago, that's where we started, right? But today now we do much bigger deployments as well, especially, as I said, in these kind of very distributed environments.
Yeah, I mean, you guys are well positioned to really capitalize in a place where you have a few thousand locations.
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting trends that we've seen is as people start moving, and for 10 years now, been moving stuff to the cloud, right, and away from that traditional regional data center. Well, when you move everything to the cloud, there's stuff that's left, right? And so what we're finding is that stuff that's left is getting pushed back to on-prem, which now the fancy word is edge for that, right? So pushed back out to the edge, well, guess what has existed out there at the edge for the last 10 years is old, junky infrastructure, right? But now you're taking applications that are critical and you're pushing them down there, and so you have to redo that infrastructure. And so it's a perfect fit for a Scale environment where you're not going to have, the same IT staff that you'd have at that central headquarters, but you still need those applications to be highly available.
You talked about the simplicity of the platform. I actually have a Scale cluster in my lab, as you probably know.
Oh yeah.
And the only time I go to the console is for 2 things: create a VM or open a support ticket so that you guys can do the upgrade for me to the next version of the code. That's it. That's the only time I go to the console. And the console is super simple. I don't like the term, but there's no nerd knobs.
Right. And that's intentional, right? Absolutely. So the product was designed to be what I call the iPhone or smartphone experience for IT infrastructure, right? So the first time that you got a smartphone, you didn't take a class, you didn't go study a bunch of stuff, you just took it out of the box, started hitting buttons and figured out how it worked. And that's the idea, right? You get this thing, you don't need certifications, even the most junior help desk person, not that you're a junior help desk person, but it's okay. Anybody can do it, right? I mean, that's the idea. And it's, it's not uncommon that we'll get tech support calls because people can't even remember how to log into it, right? Versus they might have come out of a VMware or something else environment where the console was up 24/7, right? So it's a completely different way. And again, when you're in these small environments, you have other things to do besides babysit the infrastructure.
And over the last year or two, you guys have up-leveled the environment pretty significantly. You added support for Flash, including an all-Flash platform, correct?
Yep, that's right.
So the more comprehensive workloads work well in the environment now.
Oh yeah.
You've also, the edge piece that you've talked about, you've got the Scale Computing for the edge, but for those edge environments, you can back those up to a centralized environment.
Exactly, or to the cloud, right? So we have integration sort of cloud all the way through to edge, all flash, and all spinning disk, right? So we always think about all flash as the latest thing. Most solutions out there require at least a mix of flash and spinners. But when you're talking about use cases like, secondary archival, backup, cost is a big issue, or hey, I've got 100 locations out in the front, and they're little tiny deployments, and they're just going to feed into a backup, right? Archival. Well, maybe just big fat disks is all you need there. Now, eventually that'll give way as flash drives get bigger and so forth, but tons of flexibility in how you deploy it. And one of the interesting trends we've seen in some of these very small environments is actually a use of NVMe drives in just little tiny environments, not because they need the 600,000 IOPS that drive can give them, but because heat and moving parts. And so we can deploy on a little box that has no fans, right? And it's basically disposable infrastructure effectively at that point.
Yeah, that's that's kind of funny. Well, you probably don't want to call it that.
Yeah, you get the idea, right? So
the other thing, I mean, when you talk about disaster recovery capability, especially when you look at some of these robo environments, you don't want to have to deploy separate disaster recovery instances at all these sites. You can centralize all that.
Exactly. Yeah. So you're going to have multiple sites. Again, flexibility is the key, but very common. You have a one central sort of cluster environment, and all of these remote sites kind of sending data in there or into the cloud. We've got a case study with Google with a customer of ours that was in Puerto Rico, fast food franchisee. Obviously, last year was not a good year there. Failed everything over into the cloud sort of seamlessly, and given the infrastructure, they're still running there, right? So you can do all that. In other environments, like when we do things in hospitals and schools, where you often have sort of networks of physical locations, sometimes you want to take and you want your DR is sort of the middle school to the high school to the grade school sort of thing.
So you've really turned a lot of things on its head. I mean, the notion of having to have a super expensive hypervisor with all the trappings, you've turned on its head. You've turned really hyperconverged on its head to a point as well, because a lot of the solutions out there are leveraging somewhat inefficient data path and things like that. You've really taken a really hard look at the architecture and done some really cool things with both the Linux kernel and with KVM to make this even though you have an SMB centric / mid-market centric, but really an enterprise grade platform.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, as far as the what you're referring to there affects both performance as well as the simplicity, which is sort of the key of what we do. And as far as your applications are concerned, all this infrastructure underneath just looks like a local laptop. Like I'm running an app on a laptop. That's what it should feel like to the application. And that makes it much easier to the administrator as well, right? So lot of flexibility in that.
Excellent, Jeff. I want to make sure everybody knows if you want to get a copy of Scale Computing's The Fundamentals of Hyperconverged Infrastructure, please go to www.hyperconverged.org. To learn more about Scale Computing, go to scalecomputing.com. Jeff, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
I really appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.
And thank you for watching this video.